Friends, welcome to this week's episode of Finding God in the Dark. I am Pastor Don Stevens, serving Asbury and Woodstown and St. John's in Harrisonville, New Jersey.
I am Jonathan Campbell. I'm the pastor of Lacey and I Methodist Church in Forked River.
And this week we are deviating a little bit from our usual modus operandi. I took Latin, I should know that. Um, in that we watched a Netflix series,
Yeah,
a documentary series, 6 episodes
yeah,
called Mr. McMahon. It
yeah.
is brand new, just came out this year.
This week.
Interestingly,
So
what's that?
this week.
Yeah, just this week.
Yeah,
Interesting, and I've been seeing all kinds of stuff about it. Although I've read very little, I watched it myself,
yeah.
and I've a lot of times I'll read other reviews and see what other people have to say. This I've read nothing else,
Okay.
so it's whatever I have to say about this is purely mine this time. But um, it stars. Vince McMahon is kind of
The
the
focus is Vince McMahon.
yeah, its focus is on him. There's interviews with quite a number of WWE superstars,
Yeah,
going back as far as Tony Atlas
yeah,
was in it. That was really interesting.
yeah,
The Undertaker, Triple H,
yeah,
John Cena. There's quite a lot of them. Stephanie McMahon.
yeah.
Um, and then there's some others, reporters and people who are peripheral to the business. Uh, Basically, it really is sort of a historical, kind of traces Vince from the time he bought the company from his father,
Yeah.
up until very recently when he was forced out.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
yeah, well, I want to hear what you had to say, Jonathan, because you probably come at it from a slightly different perspective than I do. In that, I'm still to this day a fan of pro wrestling, and so I followed a lot of this history. I know a lot. There wasn't a whole lot here that was new to me, but
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was really big into wrestling in my teens and into my early 20s.
Mhm.
Um, so I watched both WCW and WWF at the time, pretty
Monday Night
regularly.
Wars.
Yeah, the Monday Night Wars. And then I am a huge fan. I listen every week to Bill Simmons' podcast, which is the executive producer of this. And he probably 4 or 5 times a year has a guy on that has a show on his podcast network called The Masked Man Show. And I don't listen to The Masked Man Show, but he has him on, and the guy's name is David Shoemaker. He's in the documentary. He's the filler. In the documentaries, you have a filler. You have someone that will explain the stuff that would take too long to have somebody, and he's the filler in this documentary. And he comes on, 3 or 4 times a year, and they talk wrestling. And so I've kind of heard them as they're putting this together. And then I listened. They had about a 40-minute conversation the night it dropped, and kind of talked about the reality of all of the complications of this. And I think what's fascinating to me is it. We could do like 3 or 4 weeks on this documentary because you could talk
Good.
about the angle of families, especially dysfunctional families. We could talk about corporate greed and how it affects workers because that's wrestlers and the promoters in the industry. You
Yeah.
can also talk about kind of what does this say about America and how did this change America? At one point, one of the historians talks about the pro wrestlification of America, and they talk about kind of the overlap between the character Donald Trump played when he had a skirmish with McMahon in the early 2000s
Yeah.
versus his persona now as a presidential candidate, and how the similarity is there, and what came out of did wrestling shape his presidential persona, or did was he just like that kind of conversation. So you can go all these different directions. um
you see that same angle with Mr. McMahon in that,
Yeah,
yes, he's the businessman, he's the
yeah,
CEO, he's the behind
yeah,
the scenes guy, he's writing the shows, he's calling the shows, but he
yeah,
was also starring in the shows, and his
yeah,
personality as the Mr. McMahon character was really just an amplified version of who he was
yeah,
backstage.
yeah,
I think, back in the Donald Trump Mr. McMahon thing, that was a WrestleMania match,
yeah,
and it was a hair match.
yeah,
Loser had their head shaved.
yeah. The
Um,
horrors of having your head shaved.
which I mean, once that look, if you remember that, I remember that distinctly.
Yeah,
Once they said losers going to have their head shaved, you
you
knew
know,
Mr. McMahon was
yeah,
going to lose. Trump wasn't
yeah,
getting his
yeah.
head shaved.
He
It
wasn't
wasn't
getting his head
happening.
shaved. No, 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 no. I don't know. To me, I don't know how you've. I mean, there's like I said, there's a lot of different angles, and we'll probably touch on some. To me, the most fascinating thing was the cycle of family dysfunction that you could see play out here, right?
That's exactly the one that struck me the most, really, because it started with Vince
Yeah,
at the very
yeah,
beginning
yeah,
talking about he didn't really know his birth father,
yeah.
but his stepfather was abusive,
Mhm.
and he had a very difficult time as a kid
Yeah,
before he came into the business and
yeah.
started working for his dad.
Yeah, I mean, from what he said, from what other people said in the documentary, he had a horrible upbringing where he was abused physically. He may have been sexually abused even by his mother, like like really horrible stuff. And one of the things I thought about, because he kept going back to this thing about how you got to put everything in the past and you can't deal with it and you can't, and especially with your wife and her background, that kind of stuff, whenever I hear somebody say that, I just cringe
Yeah, me
because
too.
I go like, no, 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 you have to deal with your past.
Yep.
You don't have to do, there's a line between dwelling in it and actually dealing with it.
Right.
And
Processing,
yeah,
process it,
processing,
and
thinking
yeah.
it through. Because I think to myself, one of the things I thought when I was seeing all this, and actually when I heard the story, because I didn't know about the abuse, I really didn't know that he had that difficult of an upbringing.
Right.
I literally wanted to go up and just give the 12-year-old a hug and go like, like, I love you. It's going to be okay.
Right.
Let's figure this out. Because you see the fact that he didn't deal with this really created dysfunction throughout his family and throughout even the business that he built. Like there was huge amount levels of dysfunction because he had this dysfunction he wasn't dealing with. Like couple of the things that just really popped out at me about this issue, and maybe you saw the things too, was one where there were three things that I want to talk about that just speak deeply to me about the dysfunction here. One is Paul Levesque, who is better known as Triple H,
Triple H.
who has spent more than 30 years being a wrestler and doing crazy things and doing crazy bits and all that stuff. He says at one point the craziest thing in his life is the family he moves into or he married into.
Married into, yeah.
Like that's like, and he says that not only on screen as a promo bit, but he actually says the same thing in interviews 10 years later when he's sitting in a suit and tie. Like,
Yeah.
you know, that the weirdest thing in his life is this family that he's a part of, which is just mind blowing.
Yeah.
And then the other two things was a guy named Paul Heyman, who's better known probably as Paulie Dangerously. He's he's a manager promoter. He's a really well known kind of mic guy. Like he
Oh yeah.
says at one time,
He's
you know,
in current WWE, he's like a manager,
he's a manager
and but he's really, what they do with him is they match him up with
with
wrestlers who don't have good mic skills.
yeah, and they
He
and he and
talks
they
for them.
and specifically somebody they want to explode. He's kind of the guy who will get someone over.
Right.
Is
Right.
another term for the business. But he tells at one point where Shane is Vince's son. At one point, Shane and Vince are arguing about something they want to do, and Vince picks up a knife and goes, "Stab me right here, because you're going to have to kill me to do this,
Right.
or you can buy me out, and then if you need to, you can run me off like I did my father." And you're just like, oh my god, like, and then
Yeah.
the last one
Mm.
that really jumped out at me was he calls Shane after. they clearly have had distance, or at least Shane has left the business. So like I think probably you could argue Shane decides to leave the wrestling business so that the relationship between the family can maybe be healed. Like you can see that maybe he did
Yeah.
that, and he
Yeah.
calls and Vince McMahon calls him back for a gig. You know, he's basically, I'm going to get you back into this. And Shane was known for doing crazy stuff. And a lot of the wrestlers in the documentary talk about they think he did the crazy stuff because he was trying
Because.
to win his father's affection, right?
Yep.
Again, dysfunction, dysfunction, dysfunction.
Yeah.
You see this scene where Stephanie McMahon, who has lived her life in the business, so it's not like she isn't aware of how this stuff works and safety protocols, and she's sitting there, and you can see her really worried that Shane probably leaps and does kind of a backflip kind of thing off of probably 20 feet. Would you say probably?
He's done that a number of
Yeah,
times actually, but yeah, off the
and
he's done it off the scaffolding, he's done it
yeah,
off the top of a steel cage.
and you see her sitting right next to Vince, and Vince is telling the announcers what to say. You know, which is a common thing.
Yeah.
Backstage people, they call it the gorilla position, I think.
Yes.
Uh, the backseat people will tell sometimes the announcers what to say, and she is clearly worried about Shane, worried that Shane might die, worried that Shane might get hurt. Vince is sitting there telling, like, going, like, basically going, like, he's going to lose his, he's going to lose his status if he doesn't pull his, and like, he doesn't seem to be reacting to the fact his son might be doing something that could kill him. And, and then Shane talks about, well, that night I knew I did well because he gave me a hug. And you're just like, what? Like,
Yeah. That's it's very clear that, as you said, the dysfunction is generational, right? It
yeah,
is absolutely passed down. Now you hope, like, we don't really know a whole lot about
yeah,
Paul and Stephanie's kids. We don't know a whole lot about Shane's kids, other than there was one part
that,
where,
oh,
when
yeah,
Shane was going to go out and do this
yeah,
big stunt, that his boys
yeah,
were there, and
yeah,
that sort of thing. But we don't really know much about their relationship. I don't know
yeah.
if like, currently there's a lot of rumor that Shane's going to show up in the number one competitor now over in AEW.
Oh, okay.
Might happen, probably won't. I
Yeah,
get the sense that Shane is probably loyal to a fault.
yeah,
That he's not going to just he even though at this point Vince doesn't run WWE anymore.
yeah,
Vince is out.
yeah,
He's been, and that to me was the most interesting part of this documentary, historically at least,
yeah,
was that they were filming it
yeah,
when the most recent allegations of sex abuse and sex trafficking came out against
yeah,
him, and he cut the interviews off, and they never finished the
yeah,
interviews for this. And kind of the last half hour of the last episode, they're just kind of speculating a little
yeah.
bit. um
Yeah,
and
if you don't know, the company that owns UFC, Ultimate Fighting,
yeah,
bought WWE, and the deal though is that WWE only has 49% of the votes compared to UFC. So when Vince got in trouble this last time, it was an easy decision for UFC to just push him out.
yeah, they just pushed it. They said, yeah, that's enough of Vince and his dysfunction.
Yeah,
That's quite enough of that. And to be fair, it's, as the fans have really, we've heard it all,
yeah,
we've seen it all acted out in the ring.
yeah,
We've seen the sexual innuendo, we've seen the over the top personality. So when this stuff came out, oh, this was actually happening backstage, I think most wrestling fans were not surprised.
yeah,
Because it's almost like watching wrestling is almost like watching Jerry Springer on steroids, you
yeah,
know. And there was a whole other scandal, the steroid thing,
yeah, yeah.
so, and I've explained it that way as well. you know, um, I don't appreciate drama in real life.
Yeah,
Like I can watch a dramatic television show, a dramatic movie. I'll watch wrestling because I know it's scripted.
yeah,
But when it's real, like whatever it is in your church, in your family, that I don't have any appetite for. And it amazes me when there are people that do.
yeah,
Like I never watch stuff like Springer or Maury or any of that because it's like that's too real. And I know some of that was even scripted, but still,
sure.
that's like you want me to believe that's real, and I don't want any part of that. I like my drama scripted. You know,
Yeah. Before we shift, though, I would like probably to say that the Bible talks about this idea of generational stuff that carries on, and
oh, yeah.
that you know the people that wrote the Bible seem to be very aware of the fact that what we do will impact our grandkids. What how we live will impact our great grandkids. And I don't think we take that seriously enough. But here, over 6 episodes, you really got to see the reality that what Vince's stepfather and maybe his mother did to him has affected his kids, has affected his business, has affected numerous people that he took advantage of, and he lived out an abusive life in this world. And had he dealt with it, maybe that cycle could have been broken.
Right. Yeah, and in particular, I mean, you look at certain, I'll bring up the Chris Benoit story, right? Chris Benoit had numerous concussions,
Yeah,
and it was that CTE, that concussion syndrome,
yeah.
that scrambled his brain, caused him to kill his family and hang himself. I mean, that can you lay that at Vince's feet? I don't know if you can wholly lay it at Vince's feet because Benoit wasn't wholly a WWE guy, but there is no there's no stopgap in there.
Well,
There was no stopgap in
yeah,
there.
you have this scene with Vince and a reporter. Can't remember the guy's name, but from Real Sports. He's the guy that worked for Real Sports, HBO Real Sports,
Mhm.
and he's interviewing him, and he's talking about all of these people who have died. Like, and if you ever go on, there are websites dedicated to all the wrestlers that have died at very young
There's
ages,
there's a lot of them.
and a lot of them have died because they became addicted to painkillers, or
Mhm.
they abused steroids, or they just had injuries and didn't have proper medical care. I mean, that's Um, and he basically wants to ask Vince, "Hey, do you feel anything? Do you take any responsibility for this?" And Vince loses it and like acts like a petulant child. I mean, slams the guy's notepads up. He makes this weird, like weird kind of, "oh, you said," kind of, just he basically acts like a brat. I mean, I don't know
Mhm.
how else to explain it.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting because it speaks to the human struggle we have to take responsibility. Like, I agree with you. Benoit can't be put completely at Vince McMahon's feet. It just can't be. Benoit had some responsibility for all the decisions he made. But Vince can take some responsibility and should take some responsibility for
Yeah.
not dealing with concussions sooner, for working wrestlers way more than they should have been worked. I mean, you have
And
people
working
doing,
them when they're injured,
yeah,
and
yeah, and not paying them when they can't work. Like all of these fact, that was part of what drove Benoit to work more than he should have been working. Like that's just the reality of it. Or using painkillers, or and I think what is hardest for us, but maybe something that we as Christians especially should take seriously, is it's okay to say, okay, not all of this is my fault, but some of this is. not all of this is my responsibility, but some of it is. Why? Because nobody lives in a vacuum, you know. And I do think a healthy person and I think a healthy Christian has to recognize that we're in a community. And so when you are damaged, even if I'm tangentially connected, I'm still connected and I have some responsibility with it, you know. And I do feel like how Vince responded to, hey, do you take some responsibility for this, and kind of going overboard, acting like that was a crazy is is a is a reality you see all the time when people want to talk about systematic issues in our society, or you'll get that response from people about, oh, that's crazy. It's like, no, it's not crazy. It doesn't explain everything, but it's not crazy, and it's worth at least a conversation.
Yeah, well, I mean, even in that sense, you could even, lay some of the blame at the feet of the fans
Absolutely.
because, and let's say in particular in the Benoit situation, right? Well, one of his big finishing moves was a diving headbutt,
Yeah.
right? Off the top rope, hit. Well, dude, yeah, you're going to, if that's what the fans want to see and you keep doing it,
Yeah.
the fans have got to say, man, maybe we should not have cheered that so much or something.
Well,
I
his
don't know.
his nickname was the Crippler because he would do things that crossed the line between it seemed like a bump to this was hurting somebody, including
Yeah.
himself.
Yeah.
And yeah, I do think it is interesting. Again, I don't watch wrestling that much anymore, but I remember those over the top, especially misogynistic uh, pieces that were done. I remember like stripping women and
On panties match. Yeah. Stuff
yeah,
like that.
right, right.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling weird in the moment, and I was in my teens and early 20s, like feeling like, and yet there was no, I never had the instinct to go like, okay, I'm not going to watch this anymore.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I do have to say that when a lot of that was going on, that was Attitude Era at WWE, right?
Yes. Yes.
When a lot of that was going on, and that was also around the same time the Monday Night Wars, right?
Yeah.
And usually because you had WWE on one channel, WCW on the other channel at the same time,
Yeah.
if WWE started doing that sort of stuff, I was married at that point, right? They started doing that sort of stuff. I switched over. Okay, let's see what's on WCW now. Because
Yeah.
that didn't interest me. To this day, I don't know, call me a misogynist, I guess, but to this day, most of the women's wrestling matches don't interest me because they're slower, they're not as athletic. To me, these guys are stuntmen, they're there's something more to it than just,
Well,
wrestling moves.
but even if you notice, like again, I don't watch a ton anymore, but I've watched a couple pay-per-views recently, and not only are the women better wrestlers and they actually wrestle,
Yeah, well,
but
now they are. Yeah.
yeah, but when in the Attitude Era, they basically wore G-strings and bikinis to the
Yeah.
ring.
Yeah.
And now all of them wear, for the most part, wear actual attire. And and you can tell they take it seriously,
Mhm.
and they're actually trying to perform in the wrestling ring, not just showing some boobs and butt, like,
Yeah,
you know,
well, and you should watch the WWE does once or twice a year they do a show from Saudi Arabia. And the first couple of times they did that, there were no women on the show.
yeah,
Now there are women on the show, but when they come out, they're in a full bodysuit.
yeah,
That's cultural, I get it,
yeah,
but they don't even show a bare midriff or anything. They're in a full bodysuit.
yeah.
So, and at that point, you got the wrestling to focus on. That's all there is to look at. So,
Yeah. I also thought it was kind of interesting. I'd like to get your thoughts about. I feel like there was clearly over and over a kind of we're going to protect Vince because he's the golden goose,
yeah. Oh yeah.
and what's interesting is not only has that been proven to be ineffective or not true. I mean, the last couple of events have been some of their most successful. If you listen to kind of the backstory and what wrestlers are saying to people like Shoemaker, they're much happier without Vince around.
Yeah.
Like they feel like Paul Levesque, Triple H, and Stephanie McMahon, although she stepped back more, are better people to run the business
Yeah.
than Vince is. But I think it's funny that all of these folks, like they even talked about Bill Simmons and Shoemaker when they talked about this. They said that everybody they interviewed would start with, "Is Vince okay with this? Are you sure Vince is okay with this?" Like all of them,
Yeah.
and it just makes you think about the reality of how often cultures, a church is a good example. Think about all the pastors because they grew the church or they were really well known that churches turned a blind eye to their really bad behavior because it was like we can't exist without them, and you realize how you're just perpetuating something that ultimately will hurt the organization more than dealing with it, you know.
Yeah, I think I'm conscious of that sort of thing in my own ministry all the time because I tell my lay folks if I do something or I say something that you think is wrong, it's offensive, it's whatever, please don't keep it to yourself. Don't have the conversation in the parking lot. Come and tell me. Send
Yeah,
me an email. Come to my office. The door's always open, whatever it is. But I can't do anything about it if
yeah,
I don't know about it.
yeah,
And if I did it, I didn't know it was wrong to begin with. Because
yeah,
I'm not going to consciously do something wrong here,
yeah,
you know? So um yeah, this there's so you're right. We could do three or
yeah,
four
yeah,
episodes just on this show because there's so much depth to be mined out of it.
yeah,
Um that it's I will say this much as far as the Netflix documentary goes. Um if you like professional wrestling, if you follow professional wrestling, you will find this interesting. It is sort of a history lesson of the WWE from the time Vince took over back in the 70s um, up to present day. Um, but it's not, for me at least, it was not, there was nothing really, outrageous or revelatory. Yes, I didn't know about, I'm like you, I didn't know about Vince's abuse when he was a kid,
yeah.
which once you hear that, then you go,
They just tell you,
that's like an aha moment, right? All of a sudden, wow, all of this starts to make sense.
yeah. Can,
Particularly when he says, "Oh, I don't have," well, you just forget about it. You don't deal with it. Well, yeah,
yeah,
but you
yeah.
gotta deal with it.
One thing really quickly that I wanted to get your take on because I thought it was fascinating. They had like 20 people say he's like a father figure to me. And then they asked all of those same people, what is his legacy? And almost all of them went like, well, I'm not the right person to ask. And you're just like, like that should tell you something that it's a dysfunctional father
Yeah.
figure that he's
Now,
being
now
called.
we have to ask about your fathers. Now,
Yeah.
he was a
Well,
father figure to you. What was your father like?
Well, and yeah, but I feel like when most people say he was like a father figure to me or she was like a mother figure to me, then you ask them, okay, what will you remember or what's their legacy? They'll like start gushing about how amazing this person is or how, and none of them, except for a couple, did that. All
Yeah.
of them went like, I think I'm the wrong person to ask. And you're just like, that probably is a sign you have a dysfunctional relationship.
Is particularly certain few of the people that they talk to.
Yeah.
Vince made them.
Yes.
Mark Calloway.
Yeah.
Vince made Mark Calloway the Undertaker.
Yes.
Because
Oh,
he was in another play. He was in WCW before that. He was just mean Mark Calloway. He was a nobody.
yeah.
Vince made him the Undertaker. John Cena. Vince made him the superstar that he is. So yeah, it's you're gonna like, wow, he was like a father figure to me. He mentored me to a point where I went on to these great successes,
Yeah.
but I don't really want to talk about what kind of guy he was.
Yeah.
And yeah, that does. It speaks volumes about who Vince was for sure.
Yeah.
So Anyway, folks, if you happen to watch this, it is on Netflix. It's still out there. It's still, I think, one of the top 10 shows this week still. Um, it's it's a little long. It's like Jonathan said last week, it's about 5.5 hours watch, something like that. But not terrible if it's of interest to you.
Yeah. It's
And
a great character study, even if you don't like wrestling. It's if you like the idea of what makes a person, it's an interesting
yeah,
study of that too.
yeah, yeah, for sure. So now we had to talk about what we're gonna watch this
Next week.
week.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm leaning towards it's October.
Yeah.
We
No, I
should
hear
be
you.
doing scary movies now, right?
Absolutely. I think it's a great idea.
And I know you're not a big fan of
I'm
horror
not a
movies.
huge fan of scary movies, but that's okay.
Well, I I only like certain kinds.
Yeah.
I'm not particularly a fan of like slasher movies or anything like that. Um, but I'm looking at Netflix, but what was the one that just came to mind for me in a minute ago? Horror movies. Have you seen since we're going to do Christian here, right? Have you
Yeah.
seen The Pope's Exorcist?
I have. Yeah.
Okay. All right, maybe not that one then. That one's wild.
It is well.
That one is very wild.
Yeah.
uh have you seen The Mist?
Yeah. We've talked
Okay.
about it. Yeah.
We did talk about that's right, we did. Um do you have any that you can think of? Because we don't it doesn't have to be back and forth here if you can think of something while
Um,
I'm looking.
yeah, I'm trying to think. I usually like thrillers. That's
Mm-hmm.
usually more of my vein if I'm going horror kind of thing. I kind of lean more toward the thriller area.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know. Have you ever seen the original? Have you ever seen Manhunter, the original version uh, of
Silence of
Red
the
Dragon?
Lambs.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
Red
Red
Dragon.
Dragon, right. Silence of the Lambs, same characters, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think I've seen Manhunter. How old is that? That's a
That's 80s. Yeah, it's 80s.
1980s. Okay. Is it, do you know if it's available?
It is available. I think on some streaming. You can look it up. It's a Michael Mann movie.
86. It's
Yeah,
1986.
yeah,
It is on Peacock.
yeah.
Yeah, I have Peacock.
Okay.
So, okay, let's watch that then.
Yeah.
That sounds good. Um,
I
and
figured I figure you saw the other three that were more
I've
recent.
seen Silence of the Lambs. I've seen
The Dragon,
Red Dragon, and then the other one, the other
Hannibal,
Anthony Hopkins one.
Hannibal. Yeah, yeah,
Hannibal, yeah. Which that one, there's a couple of scenes in that one where you just go,
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
great then. So this week we're gonna go watch the 1986 thriller Manhunter. For those who are following along, if you take a look at Mr. McMahon, let us know what you thought of it.
Yeah.
See if you have something else that maybe we didn't see, something that we didn't see in it that would be interesting because we're constantly talking. So,
Yeah.
all right, friends. Until next week, take care and keep on finding God in the dark.
Bye.
Thanks for watching the Finding God in the Dark podcast. If you're enjoying these discussions, please consider hitting the like button down below or subscribing to follow along. We put out weekly episodes on Friday mornings, and we are so glad that you're finding this discussion of theology and film entertaining enough to follow along with us. Take care and God bless, friends.